My name is Abby Jenks, and I've had the pleasure of being a participant in the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant that Pelham was awarded in 2018. These grants were designed to help communities build resilience within their own towns. A community is stronger when we have strong relationships within and among the town members. The elders hold a great deal of wisdom to share about life in the past that we can utilize for the future. So this project involved having our 6th grade class from the Pelham Elementary School interview elders in town about life back when they were growing up. The kinds of things that they focused on were how they fed each other, how they got around, the kind of transportation that they utilized, what they did for fun and play, and the kinds of community events that they engaged in. So we hope that this video will help us all to understand more about the past in Pelham and give us some insight as to how we can move forward in the future as climate change approaches.
My name is Karen Ribeiro, and I'm the chair of the Select Board in the town of Pelham. This video is an intergenerational story sharing project brought to you by Connect Pelham, which is a task force that has come together through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant in the state of Massachusetts in order to help bring our community together. I think it's going to be not only powerful to witness for the students and to participate in for the elders, but also something that will stand test of time and be available for the rest of the community to watch.
What was your main source of food when you were a child?
My parents and my grandparents all had gardens. It was commonplace that everyone had a garden in their backyard. And my mother and my grandmother preserved food, jars and jars of food that went down into the cellar to use later on in the year, and especially in the winter time. The corn and the tomatoes were a special treat in the summer. They raised cattle, they fished, they hunted, they had farm animals, they had huge fields that were planted with grains and the vegetables that sustained them through the summer months and all through the winter. And their lives were very simple, and they were sustainable lives. They could take care of themselves on the plots of land that they had in Pelham. My great-grandfather, Herbert Campbell, actually owned and operated a wonderful bakery right up on Amherst Road near the church with the pink doors. The bakery was here in Pelham for 35 years, and it was known throughout all the local towns.
Right now, I could maybe go to a store and buy whatever food I felt like eating. If you were hungry in your household, what would you do?
We lived on a farm. If we wanted flour or if we wanted sugar, we had to go to the store. We raised crops. We had a garden. It was a dairy farm, so we had milk. We had a maple plantation on Mount Toby, so we had that type of sugar. What we did, my mother did, was can. She canned vegetables and tomatoes and applesauce and the things we had on the farm, she just canned. And, once you had it in a jar, it kept forever.
If you lived on a farm and the Swift River Valley, Enfield, Greenwich, Prescott, Dana, you did have a garden and you did have raised vegetables. So that really, if you had a farm in Enfield or any of those villages, you could live pretty well as far as at least having food. And you probably had a couple of pigs, and then someone would butcher those for you, so you had bacon and pork and all that sort of stuff during the winter. Chickens, everyone had chickens. We always had fresh eggs. So all our beets and carrots and turnips and root goods we would store down cellar, and then keep them and go down and use them during the winter. We talked about the recession and how it was a terrible time for everyone because no one had any money. That was particularly true if you lived in a city, because here you didn't have a farm, you just had a house or apartment, and you had problem getting food.
Whatever sorts of needs the Pelham people had in their homes were very simple. They had no electricity, as you know, no running water. Their water was gotten from buckets put into a well. They had no source of a central heating system. They basically had fireplaces and wood stoves. I believe electricity came to Pelham in about 1928 or 1929. And up until that time, kerosene lamps were used. And this heat was primarily from wood stoves. My grandparents always had huge piles of wood in back of their house. My grandfather owned property, and he cut the wood on his acreage and brought it back to their house and sawed it up. And their cellar was full of wood by the fall, getting ready for winter. My parents lived in Shutesbury. They had a dug well. My grandparents, who lived up on Amherst Road, had a dug well, and it was beautifully designed with these lovely, lovely Pelham stones. And as I recall, the well never, ever went dry.
If I had to guess, nowhere in Pelham is there an ice house. But if you lived in Enfield and had a farm, you had an ice house. We didn't have a farm pond which actually made the ice, but during the spring, people would come around with a truck filled with big chunks of ice. And that's when my parents would buy all these big chunks of ice and fill the ice house and cover them with sawdust, which meant in the middle of summer, if you opened the ice house, it was about 32 degrees, and you would chip out pieces of ice. That made it a lot cooler working on one of those.
We had no electricity. We had candles. We had wood stove to heat the house. The wood came out of the woods. That's where the fuel came from. It was a very comfortable way to live.
Transportation has changed a lot in the local area. What was it like when you were a child?
During the Second World War, you couldn't drive anyway because gas was rationed and you just couldn't buy gasoline. So you either walked or you rode a bicycle. There was a professor at Amherst College that lived where Atkins Fruit Bowl is now, and he worked at Amherst College. He walked to work. That's about 3 miles. It didn't seem to be a big deal to walk. I think I told you last time we turned our car into a tractor. Cut it up, made it into a tractor.
And what about the trolley car that used to come up to Pelham?
Yeah, I always thought they came up here to bring people to the Orient Springs, but then I heard that they were being used to transport the employees to the fish rod factory. And so you keep learning. You actually keep learning your whole life. There's something you're going to learn tomorrow that you hadn't even thought about today.
Tell us about growing up in Pelham.
Growing up in Pelham, I grew up here in the 1970s mostly, and everything was far away. So we spent a lot of time playing in the woods, and I grew up on Shutesbury Road, on 202, and so I spent a lot of time in the Quabbin and getting to know all the brooks and the ponds and some of the trees and hills quite intimately. up our own games, and break all the rules on the little signs that led into Quabbin. They'd have a list of things you're not supposed to do, and we used it as a checklist. Okay, we camped, we built fires, we rode bicycles, because there was not much else to do. But that was good, and I enjoyed having that because I got to learn a lot more about the nature of the area, and spent a lot of time fishing and just kind of climbing trees and getting to know the woods.
Growing up under the Quabbin, the first 10 or 11 years in Enfield, it's a very small town experience that probably isn't being duplicated these days. In the 1930s, this was recession, meaning that no one had any work, no one had any money. You had to make your own parties and do things, and nowadays you have the radios and the televisions and your iPhones or ePhones or whatever they're called. Those days there wasn't any of that. We used to do a lot of picnics on weekends. There was a lot of local town sports. Each of these local towns, Enfield and Greenwich and Dana, each had a baseball team, a town baseball team, a town basketball team, so that during the spring and summers, we used to go to a picnic and watch town of Enfield play maybe the town of Belchertown. And then during the winter, when we couldn't be outside, it seemed to me there was a lot of planning that each Sunday there would be a church supper. I know that when I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and not only me, but any families that were in the Enfield or the Quabbin thing, one of the real highlights that you look forward to, not only for 2 or 3 weeks, but 3 or 4 months, was the Belchertown Fair in 12th of October, I think. In fact, it still goes on. It's been there for years.
How has Pelham changed from your youth to now?
Pelham was much smaller. It was quieter, and I think the community at that time gathered together differently than the community of Pelham does now. People used to come together on Saturday nights for a potluck dinner where the whole community participated. There were not a lot of automobiles at that time, so the community as a whole was a very closely knitted group of people. I think people are so much busier than they were decades ago, and it's more difficult for people to actually find the time to come together as a community socially than they did years ago.
I think years ago that people were more tied together. I think they concentrated on community maybe in smaller, less specialized way than they do today. Little gatherings of individuals, whether it was for recreational and fun times or whether it might have been for something more specific for the community that required a lot of skills and a lot of organization. As I said before, I didn't actually grow up in Pelham, but I spent a considerable amount of time here in Pelham with my grandparents at their home on Amherst Road. And community was very, very important at that time. And people didn't venture away from community as they do now with cars and buses and airplanes. Community was basically their world, and this is where we were. Deep friendships were made. Family was very, very important. Very different because this is where we belonged and where we were, and didn't really venture very great distances away from home.
I don't know if you all are familiar with a little building across the street, the one-room schoolhouse community hall. Well, when my father was a small boy, he used to go there along with his parents, and community hall was actually what today we would call a cultural center. Everything happened at community hall, and all sorts of things happened at that little building. There were square dances, there were musicals. The men went there to play cards on weekends. People were married there. There were wedding showers and baby showers there. There were potluck dinners, there were tag sales. The Boy Scouts met there.
How did your community like pull together, like families and neighbors and things?
Well, back then, most everybody helped their neighbors. If like with us with farming, if we were doing certain thing, some neighbors would come and help us, or we'd go and help them on the farm.
How do you think climate change has affected Pelham?
I think it's affected Pelham in the sense that it's types of snowfall we get now compared to what it was when I grew up younger. And I think we're developing a few more water problems in abundant water that we never had before. Places that are wet, that we've not had water. For instance, where I live, I've lived there for 60 some odd years, and we have water flowing out of a little vernal pool next door that's been flowing for over a year now.
The weather has definitely changed in the last 26 years that I've seen. It seems like we get more ice, we get more heavy downpours, torrential rains. I've seen just the way that the storms are different, they act different. A lot of storms in the past, winter storms were pretty much mainly just snow. We have a lot more ice, we have a lot more rain, we have a lot more issues like that. There's a big difference in the type of storms that we're dealing with. It used to be nice. We used to have storms that would start as snow, end as snow, and there was a definite stop and a definite end. And now we have these storms that are switching back and forth, and they never seem to want to end.
Like Rick said, it would start as snow and end as snow, and that would be it, you know. But the storm, like you said, now they just linger on, or they come wet and then dry and wet, and so you're constantly trying to battle it.
Every storm's different, but it seems like the overall, from the way it was even 25, 26 years ago when I started here, it's changed in just that amount of time. It seems like we're getting, snow seems to be starting later. We don't get real early storms. We don't usually get a lot of snow before Christmas, and I think in the past you used to see between Thanksgiving and Christmas, you'd see more storms. These heavier storms seem to be more frequent. I've had places, people have their driveways washed out or something because of a clogged drain, and we'll go open it up, and I've never seen it rain that hard before. I've never seen that much water all at once in here, and it probably won't happen again for 20 years. And 2 weeks later, I'm back out there again and filling in their driveway for them again. And yeah, it did it again. It seems like we're getting more heavier amounts of rain in shorter amounts of time. We're getting these heavy downpours more back to back, more often. Instead of it being an annual event, it seems like, instead of only once or twice a year, you're getting it sometimes 2 or 3 times a month. You'll get these heavy downpours, and your dirt roads and your poor drainage areas suffer for it. In the next several years, there are projects that I'd like to get done to address some of this before I hopefully get a chance to retire. But I think the issues have changed on how we handle this. It's definitely changed where we're looking more more broader at it. We're looking at looking at that 100-year storm, and we're looking at, you know, making sure that we're ready for it. We want this equipment, this structure to be able to handle something like that, that we don't have a lot of washing or people's homes getting flooded and things like that. And I think it's getting more challenging, it seems like every year, that the weather just seems to be getting worse. And even the snow, I mean, in the 26 years I've been here, they've had, we broke a couple of records on the amount of snow in 1 year that was broken, and then the amount of snow in a 24-hour period. And that's just in the last 25 years that I've seen that. And you guys dealt with plenty of snow back then, so.
The roads at that time weren't all that, well, they weren't heavily used. We had cars, but the roads weren't heavily traveled. There weren't that many people here. How's that? There were a lot less people.
Our neighborhood was still kind of just growing back from having been farms and pastures the previous 100 years. You know, in the 70s, Quabbin was only 40 years old then, so a lot of the forests were very young. And we thought, oh, look at that, you know, animals are returning. There were beaver dams, which hadn't been around for a long time. Turkeys started to appear. There were quite a few deer in the area, and the occasional bear, which was unusual in those times. Now, I'm happy to say they're quite a lot more common.
Things are very, very different for us today. They're simple. We have everything at our fingertips. And I would like to share with both of you that we all have choices to make in this time that we live in. I do not have a clothes dryer. I don't have an air conditioner. I don't have a dishwasher. And I'm absolutely fine with those choices. If we all decide what's important to us and what's not important, and mostly what's important to sustain our planet, then we can make those choices. And you both, even at your young age, you have choices that you can make now, maybe that you can bring forth into your later years, things that will help our world and our planet. And we need that right now.
The difference back then, I think, there was we connected with our neighbors more than we do now. We kind of do things together, where now everybody's pretty much doing what they want to do or going in a different direction. So I think if it was more of that, it would be better myself.
Pelham is and the area, this area of Western Mass is very much like the town I grew up in. Now the town I grew up in is very developed. Mm-hmm. And when I go back to my hometown, I can get lost on Main Street because things have changed so much. Mm-hmm. And I'll be really honest with you, my personal experience is there's nothing there that I'd like to see in Pelham or where I live. Mm-hmm. I like Pelham the way it is. I like Pelham being a more of a country community, more of a rural community. You're not going to stop progress, and I understand that, but I'm not really much into, I don't want to see, I'd never want to see Pelham become a city.
It'd be nice if we could just let this earth alone. To have a real healthy earth, we could, I think, take 1/3 of it and let it go wild. We get people, if they want to be here, to live closer together. There's been many reasons why we spread out so much, and Good roads is one reason. Our roads are too good. We move out into the country. If we could all just contract and get back into a smaller community, and then let the rest, or at least 1/3 of the world, just go wild. How's that?
So some of the things that I came away with in hearing the stories of our elders were the strength of community that existed back then among all the members of the town. There was little money. People had to rely on each other in a deeper way to get things done, to build things, to harvest crops, to fix machinery. These are good lessons to be learned today. People are going to need each other and depend on each other in a way that we have lost over time. I think that some of these ways that were a way of life in the past can be brought forward into the future to strengthen our town, to strengthen the relationships that we have in town, and to help us learn how to support each other as we face the changes that our climate is bringing.